Welcome everyone to our session, Where Are We Headed with Activity Monitors in Clinical Trials? My name is Mattera, Assistant Director of the PRO Consortium with CPATH, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Before we get into the presentations, just a few quick reminders. All attendee lines will be muted during the workshop. The workshop is being recorded and will be available on the PRO Consortium's website by the end of May. One other note to make is that the WebEx event Q&A function will not be used, so we will do a question and answer later on in the session verbally. At that time, if you'd like to ask a question during the question and answer period, please open your participant panel, then click the hand icon in the lower right corner of the participant window to raise your hand. Next is just our disclaimer reminder that the views and opinions expressed in the following slides are those of the individual presenters themselves. So next, I am pleased to introduce our participants for this session. I will ask all of our presenters and panelists for this session to turn on their video at this time while I introduce you all. And as mentioned earlier, all workshop attendees did receive the full BioSketch document with the welcome materials via email, so please refer to that for additional details later. But for now, again, I am Mattera, Assistant Director of the PRO Consortium, and I will be moderating this session. We will hear some great presentations from Jennifer Goldsack of the Digital Medicine Society, Bill Byrom from Signant Health, Jiat Ling Poon of Eli Lilly and Company, and lastly, Milena Anatchkova from Evidera. After our presentations, we will get some additional perspectives from Andrew Potter from FDA, as well as Steve Blum from Bristol Myers Squibb. So thank you, presenters and panelists. We can all turn our videos back off now until after the presentations. Okay. So the goal of today's session will be to discuss practical considerations associated with activity monitors in clinical trials. I did want to mention that although other study designs will be discussed within today's sessions here and there, we do have a specific interest in use of activity monitors in clinical trials themselves. So that's just something to keep in mind here in terms of how some aspects discussed might translate into activity monitors used in clinical trials specifically. So to achieve this goal, we will first hear an overview of digital technology-based endpoints, existing and emerging resources. Then we will move on to discuss implementation and endpoint considerations associated with activity monitors. Next, we will get to learn from a case study, highlights of the digital tracking of arthritis longitudinally, or the digital study. And our last presentation will be an update from the Chronic Heart Failure Working Group, eliciting meaningful aspects of physical activity from persons with CHF. After the presentations, we will hear some remarks from our panelists, first with an FDA perspective and then an industry perspective, and then finally we'll move on to the question and answer portion of the session. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our next presenter, Jennifer Goldsack, to start us off. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for including me today. Let me just take control of the slides here. Can someone let me know if you've got these?
We can see them, Jen.
Terrific, thank you. So the goal for the next 10 to 15 minutes is ambitious, but I'm confident that we can get through it together. We're going to do a quick walk through the current state of sort of digital technology-based endpoints, and also talk through a variety of different resources that exist for this community to really work and to commit to establishing this field as an evidence-based field, maintaining the high standards that we've always maintained as we move into the digital era of research, and thrilled to be here today. For folks who don't know me, my name's Jen Goldsack. I'm the Executive Director of the Digital Medicine Society. And to start our talk, I'm going to take us back in time a little bit. Shortly after we launched DIME, so in the fall of 2019, we were very excited to put together what we believe is the first and still the only crowdsourced library of digital endpoints that are being used by industry sponsors, in their medical product development. So these aren't exploratory studies, these aren't sort of natural history studies, they're not feasibility studies. These are digital endpoints being used in the drug and other medical development pipelines. And we were absolutely delighted in the fall of 2019 to find that there were 34 different endpoints being used by industry, that 12 sponsors had taken the bold step of incorporating them into their trials, and that nearly half of the digital endpoints being used were used in phase 2 and phase 3. And we step back and we're like, my goodness, this is very exciting. This is not the stuff of the future. This is here today. We were so excited, in fact, that we went ahead. We published a first opinion piece in Stat and really thought that, you know, this was a good amount of evidence that this field, while, you know, still quite green, was actually gaining traction, gaining trust of the pharmaceutical and sort of other sort of medical product development leaders. Fast forward to today, so it's about 14, 15 months after we launched the library, and this is the current state of the field. We can see that there are 166 unique endpoints that have been captured. Over half of them are being used in phase 2 and phase 3, and 52 sponsors have gone ahead and collected these digital endpoints. And in fact, you can see that this was last updated in January. We're just about to publish the findings of a more recent update that's going to take us under or over the 200 measure mark. That's going to take us to 64 sponsors, and it's going to increase the number or the relative number of those endpoints being used in phase 2 and phase 3 studies. I think it's also really important to note that these measures are being used as primary endpoints. So it's not that across the board, these digital endpoints are being included only as exploratory endpoints, but really there is a level of acceptance by industry that I think is absolutely extraordinary in terms of the pace it's gained over the last 14 to 15 months. It's interesting to think, though, that is this a good thing? You know, I presented this library to a really terrific audience and had a really wonderful sort of enthusiastic response that said, my goodness, well, this is great. There's sort of 160, or as I shared, just over 200 endpoints in this library. Maybe by the end of 2021, there'll be 1,000. And I thought to myself, I really hope not. There aren't 1,000 interesting things to measure. And I think it's really important that we pause and think about, you know, what are we actually chasing after here? Are we measuring the most meaningful aspects of health? Are we being intentional in how we deploy these digital tools? Are we collaborating? Are we being mindful of what our colleagues in the field are doing? To me, it's a bit of a red flag as I go through 200 endpoints as there are in the library right now, and I don't see a single endpoint used twice. And if you have questions about what's contained, first of all, if you don't have your magnifying glass, this is fine. This is just intended to depict the resource that's available to you at open source at the DIME website. This is a fully searchable database that you can probe by health concept, that you can probe by type of technology, that you can probe by endpoint positioning, that you can probe by phase of trial, by sponsor, so on and so forth. There's an awful lot of information here, and I encourage all of you to use this as a resource if you are thinking about it's sort of developing a digital endpoint or utilizing a digital endpoint. It would be really useful, I think, to establish what your peers in industry are already doing and the maturity of that measure, which can be inferred from sort of how it's positioned, which can be inferred from which phase of the trial it's placed in. So we've done a whistle-stop tour through how these measures are being used in industry right now. That's great. If you are embarking on your own sort of measure development, or if you are thinking about deploying an endpoint in your own clinical study, how do you know what's the right one for you? And how do you know if you have sufficient evidence to support its use in the context in which you're interested? There's a couple of what I will add some editorial here and say a couple of publications that I think are incredibly important to help you answer that question. First, the V3 framework to help you establish whether the measure itself is fit for purpose. The second is an evaluation framework once you've established that a measure is indeed fit for purpose, that will help take you through other key considerations related to the technology. If we think about what is in the V3 framework, it's a modular evaluation process that passes out the tech stack, as our tech colleagues would call it, of the digital clinical measure. Verification describes the engineering testing that goes on to demonstrate that the performance meets the specification standards of your measure. Analytical validation looks at the algorithm that's taking that lightly processed data from the technology and manipulating it into clinically informative data. Clinical validation, a process that I'm absolutely certain everyone on this line is very familiar with, is the process of sort of proving that this measure is relevant, valuable, things like minimum clinically meaningful change. And why is this important? Why is this sort of stepwise approach valuable? First of all, it gives us the opportunity to think about translating technologies or translating measures into different contexts of use. We can really think about the fact, you know, one of the big concerns I know folks have is, you know, my goodness, if there's an update to the operating system, does that blow up the entire stack as we can see it here? Do we have to go back to the drawing board? No. When you deploy the V3 framework, you can either simply complete re-verification to confirm that the output data from the technology still meets the needs of your measure, and or you can get documentation from your tech colleagues to prove that there's still back compatibility of the data, even with the new operating system, for example. If you want to think about changes that might sort of affect the software or the algorithm, we can think about repeating the analytical validation process only to confirm that that algorithm, perhaps it's updated due to new data, perhaps you want to use a better performing algorithm. You can take just one step to confirm that it's not going to negate previous data you may have collected using the same measure, or previous versions of that algorithm. And finally, clinical validation. I think this is really important when we think about the possibility of translating measures in one indication, in one context of use, into other areas. It may not be necessary to go all the way back to the bottom of the tech stack to verification. If you want to, for example, begin using a digital clinical measure in a new population, you can start with your clinical validation. And if the performance of the measure is borne out in a new population, in a new context of use, you don't have to dig any deeper into that tech stack. This is a really, really important, I think, process for us all to be aware of. There's a lot of activation energy that's necessary to start developing and deploying these measures. This will allow us to be as rigorous and as agile as possible. It also identifies the different roles and the different ways we need to be collaborating and looking to our other expert colleagues in order to really expedite the process and make sure it's completed with the highest quality. Verification is a process that our engineering colleagues have been completed for decades. They don't need us to help them. We simply need to understand the documentation, the high quality documentation of their processes. We do need to think about collaborating with our engineering colleagues and our data science colleagues for the analytical validation. That's an all hands on deck step. And then we've all been completing clinical validation for decades also. That's very much in-house for us. And I think being clear about the colleagues that you need at the table and when we need to be able to trust external colleagues and partners and the documentation we should expect is absolutely critical. The V3 framework has really been, I think, very positive for the field. I know of at least 35 companies that have adopted it as their standard with respect to digital clinical measures, especially as digital drug development tools. And even our colleagues at EMA are starting to reference this work heavily in their thinking around the use of digital drug development tools. Some allied work also extrapolates the V3 framework to try and put it in conversation with other areas of scholarship and expertise that are well established. For example, one of the working groups within DIME's research committee, led by Elena Ismailova from Connexa, they they have published a really terrific piece on the similarities and differences between the V3 process for establishing fit for purpose for digital clinical measures and the way that we have developed and built trust in lab biomarkers. And so for folks with a background in the wet lab and in wet biomarkers, really encourage you to read this manuscript to understand how all of your expertise can be pulled forward into the digital era. I'm also noticing that the sources are not on these slides. I will make sure that they are updated before this is circulated. This is really important. As I said, we're not going to take a deep dive into everything, and I want to make sure you all have the resources. So I'm also very excited that my colleague Bill Byrom is following me in this panel. He and I had the pleasure of working with a variety of other colleagues, including Sonia, who's on the line, to really think about, what does the evidence dossier look like? This work has been done. There's a very, very robust manuscript with an appendix that outlines all of the evidence you need to document in order to support the use of a digital clinical measure as an endpoint. And again, I would direct you to this resource if it's on your roadmap. Great. Okay, so we've done, now we've covered what's the state of the use of these tools. How do we think about fit for purpose of the measure itself? Well, what about the technology? Knowing that the measure itself performs well isn't enough to declare success and isn't enough for you to be able to decide to use a digital clinical measure. You also need to think about the security of the technology. You also need to think about the data rights and governance of this data as it flows through vendor servers and making sure that those end user license agreement, those terms of use are actually aligned with what you have in your informed consent forms. We need to think about the utility and usability of the technology, both for the population of interest, but also for your data science colleagues. You need to make sure that the data is coming in such a way that it has utility and is usable. And trust me, your data science teams, your biostats colleagues will thank you for thinking about this as you select your technologies and your vendor partners. And of course, it's probably quite possible to get the perfect technology if you pay through the nose for it. How can we do it in such a way that it actually makes economic sense to take forward into trials at scale? I'm going to whiz through a couple of things just to make sure we close out on time, but a few more important resources to share with you before I hand over to Bill. First of all, this is all great, but one of the things that I think is really important as we enter this digital era of health is that we don't lose sight of the why. It's not about the shiny gadget. More technology isn't better, but more solved problems is better. And when that comes to digital clinical measures, that comes back to selecting measures that matter to the patient. Shame on us if we're starting with the shiny technology. Shame on us if we are starting with signals in the data. We need to make sure that every step of the way, we are picking measures that matter. It doesn't matter how well your measures perform if you didn't pick the right one in the first place. So I'm going to leave you with one more set of resources before I turn it over. You'll notice that in the last, I think, 5 minutes, we went through about 6 or 7 different publications. That's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the information that you need to develop and deploy these digital clinical measures as endpoints. That's not intended to be an overwhelming statement, and I'm sure it's not news to you. I'm sure you've all been scrambling around trying to find the right evidence to justify your decisions with your teams. We have been very cognizant of that at Dime, and that was the impetus for us partnering with 29 different organizations that you can see showcased down here to develop the playbook for digital clinical measures. And really what we were delighted about was the agreement from industry to come together and say, yes, we have to start with the measure before we move to selecting the technology, before we think about operationalizing it, and then digging down to create over 400 slides that outline in detail for you this process. We also need to think about ethics. We need to think about benchmarking these processes. We need to think about the necessary standards for success and the necessary policy and regulatory landscape. All of this is contained for you within the playbook. And actually on April 30th, we are launching a whole new suite of resources, moving away from the 400 slide sort of single offering to over 100 resources that will help walk you through these myriad processes that everyone on your team needs to be comfortable with. We try and have some fun with this. We talked about the importance of order. It's not starting with a cool Apple Watch that you saw at a conference that winds up with very expensive data that you can't use. It's not starting operationally. Let's just throw this into our trial as an exploratory endpoint and see what happens. And again, being unable to get usable data. It's about thinking about the data and the patient. It's about thinking about the technology second and not first, before making sure that we are eyes wide open to what we need on deck for operational success. And with that, I'm going to skip ahead a few slides. They will all be available to you after the fact, and they are all available to you at playbook.dimesociety.org. And with that, thank you so much for including me today. And Bill, let me hand over to you to take us through our next set of remarks.
Thanks, Jen. That was, as always, really, really good and comprehensive, and a great overview. And actually, thank you for driving all the valuable work that DIME's been doing in terms of delivering in this area. So, so thank you very much. There we go. Looks like I'm up to speed with my slides. Great. So I'm going to talk specifically about implementation and endpoint considerations. Just trying to move my slides. There we go. Okay. So I think as we consider the use of any sensor solution to provide data for clinical trial endpoints, there's a number of challenges and potential gaps in our knowledge that we need to consider. And so whilst these are somewhat generic, they actually do apply as we think about considerations for use of activity monitors. So first, are we measuring something meaningful? And Jen mentioned this. Now, we can derive lots of summary measures from activity monitor data, but which will measure aspects of health that are the most meaningful to that specific population that we want to study? Actually, Milena is going to touch on this area later in her presentation. So secondly, how do we decide how to implement the monitor? So how long should patients wear it for? Where should they wear it? How do we manage the data? What do we do about missing data? And I'm going to cover this briefly in a moment. Third, are activity endpoints like total steps per day device agnostic? So in other words, can the results from my trial that measure the same endpoint but perhaps use different devices, are those different trials and endpoints comparable? And this is clearly a very desirable endpoint property, but is it actually possible? And we'll talk about this in a moment as well. And then finally, do we understand the evidence needed to support our selection of a particular activity monitor if we're going to use the data to support a regulatory submission? And Jen's just given us a great overview of this work and the playbook framework, for example, to help to deal with this. So first, let's talk about implementation and data management considerations. So 4 or 5 years ago, I worked with a researcher called Dave Rowe at Strathclyde University on a review of published studies using activity monitors in COPD research. And our aim was to derive a consensus standard on implementation methodology based on what we could see in the literature. And while we were able to propose a set of best practice standards, actually the studies themselves that we looked at varied considerably. You know, there were many different placement locations studied. There were lots of different ideas about the period of wear time needed to study activity in these patients. Lots of different rules about handling the data and particularly missing data, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And you know, in common with what Jen just mentioned about the number of endpoints that she's seen and the fact that they're very rarely reused, you know, we saw 76 studies and over 80 endpoints actually published as part of these reports. So, you know, on the surface of it, not easy to derive a consensus approach from this sort of review of data. But while it would be comforting if there was a well-trodden and a well-accepted methodology, you can actually establish this yourself by considering a few basic things. And some of those are listed here. So, first of all, where would I ask a patient to wear the device? And for activity monitors, we know that the hip is close to your center of mass, and so as a result, it's good at estimating things like energy expenditure. We also know it's good at distinguishing different levels of activity, like when a patient's inactive or light, moderate, and vigorous physical activity. The wrist, on the other hand, tends to overestimate physical activity because you've got extraneous movements to deal with. And it's poorer at distinguishing light physical activity from other types of activity. However, we know as well that the wrist is associated with much better wear compliance. And then think about another placement location, the thigh. The thigh is poorer at assessing things like energy, but it's superior at distinguishing sedentary behavior. If you think about the thigh, my thigh is horizontal when I'm sitting or lying, and it's vertical when I'm standing. So the accelerometer inside the device can actually act as an inclinometer. It can enable me to precisely distinguish between sitting and lying and standing. And it might sound like an inconvenient location, but consider maybe a patch solution or a small sensor that we might adhere under a tegaderm dressing, like the ActivePal device, as an example. So moving on, how long should the device be worn for? And this is actually a rather endpoint specific question. If I'm interested in a total daily measure, like total daily steps or total counts, I need the patient to wear the data for most of that waking day. If, on the other hand, I'm looking for something like cadence or walking speed, well, actually, these measures are fairly consistent between walking bouts. So I might only need to measure 1 or 2 bouts of purposeful walking on a particular day to be able to estimate this well. Thinking about things like sample rates, typically 60 to 100 hertz or samples per minute is good for activity monitoring, but actually lower sample rates are also quite feasible. Shorter epochs, or the way we divide data up into segments across the day, are helpful to distinguish things like sedentary behavior and capture transitions between sitting and standing. And we talk a little bit more about epochs in a moment, so I'll just hold that thought. And then finally, data management rules. Typically we don't see any effort to impute missing data when you look at activity monitoring data. Days considered, the way we consider it is we look at whether there's sufficient data within a day to call it a valid day. And a valid day would be just a number of hours over that particular measurement period that we think is sufficient to measure the activity for that day. And then we need to think about the number of valid days that we might need to get an accurate picture of the overall activity profile. So valid days and number of valid days tend to be things that people think about with activity monitored data. But we also need to think about how those definitions might flex dependent upon the endpoint again. So again, something like daily steps, actually I do need to have a decent length of the day where I'm measuring for. Something like speed and cadence, actually I can have a different definition of what I think a valid day might be. We also need rules for detecting non-wear intervals. So some wrist-worn accelerometers have got wear detectors, or they might measure other things like heart rate that can inform us whether a device is being worn. But if you wear something on the hip or other wear locations, they don't support that. So in adults, we tend to assume or make a rule that perhaps 1 hour of no measured activity is actually enough to indicate that the patient isn't wearing the device. And in children, we actually might choose a shorter time interval to indicate no wear in that group. So I think that's sort of some of the rules that we might apply to start to think about how we can approach a standard way to implement an activity monitor in a clinical trial. The second point I wanted to touch on were, are endpoints device agnostic? And it's an important question. I need to know if I can interchange activity devices within a study or within a development program. So for example, what if my current device is superseded and it can't use it anymore? It's not available for me to use anymore. Can I compare or pool data across studies that use different devices but measure the same endpoint? What about a regulator? Can a regulator compare data on the same endpoint provided by different sponsors but using different devices to measure that endpoint? And then what about bring your own device? Many people have got their own activity monitors. Can they opt to share their data rather than to wear the study device? Well, what do we know already? We know that consumer devices for activity monitoring can vary quite a bit in their measurements. So this example from Bender and colleagues showed that step counts, distance travelled and calories burned could vary up to 30% between devices when you wore those devices concurrently. And they studied Fitbit, Garmin and Apple Watches. What about devices developed specifically for clinical research though? So if we look at the EU approval of the proactive endpoint for COPD, that's a composite measure that's composed of both patient diary data and also activity monitor data. And the developers used two different research grade devices to measure activity, but they needed two different conversions to calculate the endpoint using each device. So maybe not great so far in terms of our aspiration to develop device-independent endpoints. But I don't think all is lost. Let's consider the type of data that these devices typically produce. And there are three levels to that data, and actually Jen referred to this a little bit in her presentation. So the most granular level is the raw accelerations that are captured by the onboard sensor. And these are usually reflected, as you can see here on this diagram, as accelerations across three separate axes, as you can see. The next level down, we've got epoch level data. So this is where we summarize those raw accelerations into activity levels or counts within each interval. So if I have a 1 minute epoch, I would have 1,440 intervals across a day that I'd summarize that data into, as you can see there in the plot on the right hand side. And then finally, daily summaries. So these are overall outcome measures like total steps that are generated by device-specific algorithms. And so for most consumer devices, these algorithms are proprietary, they're black box, they're built into the solution. And this is one of the reasons, perhaps, for variability between makes and models in the measurement properties, just like we saw with the Bender study example. Both epoch level and daily summary data are subject to the proprietary algorithms of the device itself. However, raw data is much more consistent between devices, and typically, devices actually are composed of similar sensors. So there are minor differences at this raw data level in the processing and filtering of the data, but these are much smaller differences than we would see in the process data that when we get down to an epoch level or a daily summary. And these are generated by the proprietary methods built into those solutions. So devices intended for clinical research often enable researchers to access the raw data. And this means that we can then apply outside of the device a standard set of algorithms to process the data and generate the outcome measures. And then these outcome measures can then be used in clinical trial endpoints, independent perhaps of the device used to collect the data. And I think this is where our hope lies in the generation of device agnostic endpoints when it comes to activity monitors. But I have to acknowledge there's more work needed here as well. But for now, this shouldn't be a barrier to us. Now we can, and as you'll see in the examples that we see next, we can gain very rich insights into treatment effects using activity monitors in our clinical trials. So my advice is that we select a suitable device and where possible, keep that consistent within an individual development program. And at that point, I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I'm really excited to hand over to Jiat, who's going to give some practical experience of using these devices in clinical research.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone for attending today, and to the PRO Consortium for inviting me to speak. Before I begin, my name is Jiat. I am a principal research scientist in the Patient-Focused Outcomes Center of Expertise at Eli Lilly and Company, and I'm speaking here today on behalf of my Lilly colleagues and our collaborators at the Global Healthy Living Foundation and the University of Alabama in Birmingham, who worked with us on this digital study. And also want to thank our participants from the Arthritis Power Registry that was jointly developed by the Global Healthy Living Foundation and the UAB and funded through PCORI. So this study really began as a proof of concept study internally, where in addition to the scientific objectives of the study, a key goal was really to assess the feasibility of and outline the operational processes for incorporating data collection with commercial grade wearables into an observational study setting, and then also informing how we can further integrate this into a clinical study down the road. For many of you who know me, you will know that I'm a firm proponent of the complementary nature of digital sensor measures and patient-reported outcomes in understanding the overall patient experience. However, you have to admit that sometimes describing that relationship and its complementary nature is not always the most straightforward. So the primary objective of the digital study was to assess the agreement between digital sensor measures. In this case, we used a Fitbit Versa, and patient-reported outcome measures from participants with rheumatoid arthritis. We've also got a whole bunch of secondary and exploratory objectives that's listed here, but for today, we'll be focusing only on the primary objectives. So then, as I mentioned before, the study population was recruited from the Arthritis Power Registry, which is a registry of people living with about 17 different types of disease states, including rheumatoid arthritis. For the study, we only looked at the RA population and recruited from the RA population. And one thing unique about this study and the study population is that participants obviously were part of this whole registry and already owned a smartphone and were completing daily and weekly assessments about their symptoms and flare-ups and things like that. And so this was a participant that was already kind of used to performing such tasks as were required in our study. Next, we have the study schema described here. As an intentional part of the study design, we actually built in a 2-week lead-in period where participants had to complete daily and weekly PRO measures for at least 10 of 14 days in that 2-week period. You'll notice that on the schema, though, we actually have up to a 4-week lead-in period because we wanted to allow participants the opportunity to have at least one do-over of the lead-in period if, for whatever family emergency of extenuating life circumstances, they were unable to complete that initial lead-in period, and not because they were just not compliant or not interested. Participants meeting this lead-in criteria would then send their Fitbit Versa and had to complete daily PRO measures, weekly PRO measures, and also provide Fitbit data for the 12 weeks of the main study period. Participants received daily reminders throughout the lead-in and main study period through push notifications to their Arthritis Power app. And after 12 weeks, we also incorporated a lead-out period where no daily reminders were sent to participants. And this was also to help us evaluate what the quote-unquote natural adherence to providing data would be in a non-study setting. So basically what happens if you're not constantly being reminded to sync your data. So then, as part of the study, the following battery of weekly and daily PRO measures were assessed. Selected smartwatch measures that we'll be talking about today include activity measures, heart rate measures, and selected sleep measures. For the primary objectives, we used Pearson's correlation coefficients to assess the agreement between the PRO and the smartwatch measures. So then, as I mentioned before, part of this was a proof of concept to kind of work through the operational feasibility of implementing such a study. At the start of the study, we did a pilot soft launch with 17 participants to work out any kinks and collect participant experience feedback prior to the full study rollout. Soft launch participants generally gave very positive feedback about their study experience and also made suggestions to us on how to improve the process. Most of their feedback could be bucketed into 3 main categories that are listed here on this slide. Key takeaways were that, participants liked being able to see their own data to help them, for themselves, understand their own sleep and activity patterns, and to also be more self-aware of their activities, their symptom fluctuations, and the relationship between the symptoms that they themselves were experiencing in their day-to-day lives. Participants did also provide feedback on, confusion and difficulties with data entry and initial smartwatch setup, which helped us improve our study process and how we provided them with setup information when we first sent them their Fitbits. Unsurprisingly, participants also spoke about discomfort wearing their watches, forgetting to wear their watches, or forgetting to put it back on after they charge the devices, or after taking showers. Most participants did appreciate the frequent reminders to complete their PRO assessments and sync their devices. Somewhat surprisingly to me is that some actually even suggested that they wanted more frequent reminders, which, for me, I constantly get annoyed by all these push notifications on my phone, so this one was actually somewhat surprising to me. So then, looking at our participant demographics, for the full study rollout, including our 17 pilot participants, we had 278 participants who qualified for the main study period, being age 50 and mean time since diagnosis of 9 years. Unsurprisingly, for observational studies and for the disease state, there was a predominantly female population, even though it's still slightly more lopsided towards the women than men. And our sample was also overwhelmingly white, which I think you'll all agree with me is not exactly very generalizable or desirable. And most participants had, apart from their RA, had concomitant rheumatic or musculoskeletal condition. We also collected our participants' employment status and regular work schedule to allow us to account and adjust for their activity patterns based on their daily schedule. For example, do they work night shifts, for example, or irregular shift hours? And then at baseline, the mean pain and fatigue NRS scores were approximately kind of in the middle of the range. In looking at the main results, this is a very colorful figure. I want to first orient you on how to interpret this figure and the one that I'll be showing on the next slide. So the size and depth of color of the circles indicate the magnitude of the correlation between each of those measures. So this, the larger the circle, the greater the correlation. The darker the circle, the greater the correlation. So they essentially, size and depth of color mean the same thing, just presented 2 different ways for people who may prefer to look at it in terms of color or size of circles. Blue denotes positive correlations, red denotes negative correlations. And as you can see, the strongest correlation was unsurprisingly observed between step count and distance walk and patient-reported outcomes. And even then, it's only a moderate correlation. Since the Fitbit Versa does not have an inbuilt GPS, the distance walk is derived from the step count, so that relationship of those two with the PRO measures is not unsurprising. The derived activity measures were not strongly correlated with the PROs, as the derived data also includes, could also have included manual entry of activity by participants. And because most participants did not make use of this feature of the Fitbit, the actual rate of activity tracking is actually inaccurate, and this may partially explain the lower correlation. And as Bill mentioned before this, given that this is a commercial grade device, despite the fact that we had access to what is supposedly the raw data on Fitbase for the analysis, much of the algorithm for deriving the activity measures is still a black box, which of course is a limitation for those who want to use such devices in clinical studies. So then looking at the sleep parameters, again, we see fairly weak correlations all around, despite some of them reaching statistical significance, with the strongest correlations observed between sleep efficiency and measures of pain and RA flare. And as you can see from the figure, it's kind of difficult to draw conclusions of relationships between other derived sleep parameters and PRO measures with all the lighter shade of blues and reds. So then, in terms of key findings from this study focusing on the study objectives, we saw low to moderate linear agreement with PRO measures in steps or distance, with greatest correlations observed with patient-reported physical function. While not strongly correlated, associations between derived activity measures and patient-reported pain, fatigue, and physical function were significant. And in general, daily and weekly PRO measures were correlated in appropriate direction with smartwatch measures. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, it's very difficult to interpret sleep from Fitbit and sleep PRO measures. And we think this is because sleep is less likely to be consciously adjusted by participants. We also hypothesized in reviewing the graphs of the pain and the wearable data over time that response to pain is patient-specific. Some patients may become more active in response to pain, others may reduce their activity. And so, one of the additional stuff that we're doing now in a follow-on study to this is, looking into coping mechanisms, and characterizing how patients cope, what patients' different styles of coping with the pain and the symptoms are in their daily lives. Also, as a key motivation of this study was the proof of concept to learn more about implementing large-scale observational studies involving provisioning of wearables, electronic data collection, and all that fun stuff. A key learning from the operational perspective was that the soft launch is invaluable. Participants were fairly adherent over 12 weeks and wanted daily reminders to complete their tasks. The black box of the algorithm did make interpretation of the derived variables non-transparent and difficult, which is something that we have to further explore. And in the lead out, without daily reminders, participation plummeted almost immediately, even though people had this nice consumer-grade watch that they could wear and go about their daily lives. So in terms of next steps, right, the full analysis for the secondary and exploratory objectives of this study are still ongoing, and these are some of the analysis that we're looking into. And future research questions we have include looking at the relevance of intraday activity patterns, and also how to interpret sleep, not just from the Fitbit data, but also from sleep PRO measures. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I'm going to hand it over now to Milena to speak about some of the work that we've been working on together with the Heart Failure Working Group.
Thank you, Jiat. I'm Milena Anatchkova, Senior Research Leader at Evidera, and today I'll be presenting the results of a qualitative study that was aiming to elicit meaningful aspects of physical activity from persons with chronic heart failure. As both Jen and Bill mentioned, it is really important to understand, are the things that these fancy devices measure really meaningful to patients from their perspective? Okay, let me see. I don't seem to be able to move the slides. Okay. The project is supported by an FDA grant and is part of the research activities of the PRO Consortium Chronic Heart Failure Group, as Jiat mentioned. All participating members are listed on these slides, and I would like to thank them for an engaging collaboration that led to these results, and hopefully will continue. What was the rationale for conducting this study? Recent FDA guidance on endpoints for drug development in heart failure states that an improvement in symptoms or physical function can be the basis for drug approval, even in the absence of effect on survival or hospitalizations. Physical activity can be assessed through wearable devices, but there is a gap in the literature on what aspects of physical activities are actually meaningful to people with chronic heart failure. The Patient-Reported Outcome Consortium Chronic Heart Failure Working Group is pursuing an FDA qualification of a CHF activity monitor-based endpoint measure. And this project aimed to provide understanding on the meaningful aspects of physical activity for this population. Specifically, the objectives of the study were to characterize the types of physical activities inside and outside the home that are important to people with heart failure, and also to determine whether activities that are relevant can be measured by a physical monitor. This was a cross-sectional qualitative study with telephone interviews. Evaluation of saturation was conducted following the 28th interview, and as saturation was reached, interviews were stopped following the 31st interview. Analysis included descriptive statistics and content analysis. A coding dictionary was developed based on the interview guide, and it included 24 codes for activities inside the house. For 14 of these activities, we had eliciting probes included in the guide. There were 22 codes with 12 eliciting probes for the activities outside the home. The 31 participants in the study were recruited from sites across the United States. The median age was 68 years old. Approximately half were female and approximately half were white. 40% reported using an assistive device and 60% had heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. The distribution across severity is reflective of what you would expect in that population. At the start of the interview, participants were asked, what does physical activity mean to them? Most of the participants mentioned daily activities such as cooking, cleaning, and shopping, while some participants also noted specific activities they do to maintain health. Walking was mentioned both in the context of general activities and as something participants reported doing to maintain health. Saturation in the discussion of physical activities inside the home was reached by the 21st interview, and all codes from the coding dictionary were used by the 16th interview. New activities mentioned by participants for which new codes were added included hobbies, dancing, and playing with grandkids. Results also showed some interesting patterns. Activities for which we had elicitation probes, so expected would be relevant in the interviews, were endorsed as relevant by most participants, as you can see in the numbers in the blue outline. But these activities did not consistently emerge spontaneously. Walking on flat surface was among the activities in the house that participants selected as meaningful, along with personal care activities and household chores, while climbing stairs appeared as the activity that most commonly was reported as something that participants say they can do but avoid doing. This was followed by cooking and vacuuming. The indoors activities that were spontaneously mentioned by participants in the absence of a probe in the interview guide were primarily related to accomplishing household chores, and two of these, cooking and general cleaning, were among the ones that most frequently was rated as meaningful by patients, among the most meaningful. In addition to finding out what activities inside the home participants with heart failure find relevant and meaningful, we also wanted to try to understand whether participants find some specific dimensions of activity, such as speed, duration, frequency, or intensity of the activities to be of particular importance. To that end, we asked participants to rate these dimensions for 3 of the activities that they find most meaningful. Results suggested that overall, the ability to do the activity in general or fulfill the task that they want to fulfill is most relevant. That was followed by how difficult it is to perform the activity, while speed, for example, was rated as least relevant across all of the activities rated. The slide only presents the top 3. Of note, depending on what activities were selected as most meaningful, some of these dimensions were really challenging and difficult to evaluate in the interviews because the questions simply were not interpreted or understood by participants. For the physical activities outside the home, the saturation was reached by the 22nd interview, when the last new unique activity was mentioned. A larger number of new unique activities were mentioned by participants for activities outside the home. These included landscaping, grilling, going to the gym, fishing, and doing outdoor activities with animals, such as walking dogs or bird watching. Activities that most frequently emerge spontaneously tended to also be selected as most meaningful for the activities outside the home. And that applied for both activities that had probes in the guide and did not have probes in the guide. So these important ones included walking on flat surface, shopping, gardening, running errands. Other activities with probes in the guide, such as going up and down stairs, standing, were noted as relevant, but were endorsed less often as meaningful to participants. Walking on flat surface was an activity that was most often selected among the most meaningful outdoor activities, but it also was most frequently mentioned as an activity participants actually cannot do. This was comparable with the results for gardening. The finding for walking on flat surface in particular, we think is probably related to being unable to walk for more than 10 minutes, as the probe included this specific additional time frame. Strenuous activities such as hiking, jumping, going to the gym were mentioned by a very few participants, so they emerged, but were not selected as meaningful. The pattern for the dimensions of outdoor activity seemed to be very similar to the one in activities inside the home, with the ability to do the activity and fulfill a task in general emerging as most relevant, while speed was least relevant. As we explored some of the activities both in the context inside and outside of the home, we wanted to see if the context would make a difference. And results suggested that the context does make a difference. For example, walking on flat surface emerged more frequently as important and difficult outdoors, while climbing stairs, lifting and carrying items was more frequently selected as meaningful indoors. So in summary, I think we had several lessons learned. Overall, participants seemed to have narratives that focused more on activities related to accomplishing tasks, taking care of themselves, or relating to others, and less so on individual activity components that are easily captured by wearables. Walking was an interesting and common important concept that is relevant both inside and outside the home, and it can be readily measured by devices. But overall, it seemed that some translation of the constructs measured by activity monitors to the activities that participants actually find meaningful is needed. There were also some lessons learned from the design of the study. From participants' perspectives, there is really a substantial overlap in the concepts of physical function, physical activity, activities of daily living, and social participation. And trying to keep these constructs separate in interviews is really challenging. In addition, the attempt to evaluate specific dimensions of activity turned out to be more challenging than we anticipated, especially with task-oriented activities. For example, it is very difficult to answer, is it important how fast you can go to the doctor? And that was an activity that participants find meaningful. Finally, as the data collection for this study was conducted during the pandemic, there were some logistical challenges related to social distancing measures. And in addition, these measures may have also led to changes in the activity levels, especially for the activities outside the home, which in turn may have influenced the responses to some of the questions, even though we did ask participants to think of their activity levels prior to the measures being introduced. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I will hand over to the moderator for the panel discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Milena. And thank you so much to all our presenters for those excellent presentations, lots to think about. So now we get to hear from our panelists, and we'll first start off with Andrew Potter with an FDA perspective. Andrew, if you're able to, please turn your video on for your remarks, if that's okay.
yeah, you should see me now. All right, thank you. Thank you, Maria, and for the kind of introduction, and thank you to the presenters for very interesting presentations. So, yeah, FDA is, we're interested in seeing digital health or endpoints measured by digital health technologies, and we've got, and while there's discussion about the several approaches. Sorry about that. I just got a text, a Skype message from someone. So, there's a lot of choices about endpoints and specific digital health technologies that you're going to use to measure the endpoint. So when you're deciding on kind of what endpoint you want to measure and what technology you want to use to measure it, you definitely should come in to talk to FDA. So FDA does not require your DHT, your digital health technology, to be a medical device. However, some DHTs could be determined by CDRH by FDA, and specifically CDRH to be a medical device. So early on in development, it would be good to request a meeting with FDA to discuss, primarily with the Digital Health Center of Excellence, but you can also contact the review division, and they will be in CDER, and they will be in touch with the Digital Health Center of Excellence. In addition, if your digital health technology is a cleared or has CDRH clearance, there may be it may have some evidence you need to support the endpoint, but it also may not have the evidence to support the endpoint. When you're coming in to discuss with FDA, be aware that CDER has not endorsed the approach taken by DIME. We may ask for very similar evidence, but you should reach out to FDA early on to confirm that the approach you're planning to take is something that CDER would agree with and will provide the appropriate evidence needed for regulatory decision making. In addition, with some of the discussions with FDA and in Dr. Byrom's presentation, as well as several others, there was a lot of endpoints that were derived from intensive data. So it's important to discuss with FDA of what timescales of the data will need to be submitted to FDA. So what data is needed to support the endpoint? What data is needed when you've developed a drug and you're coming in for an NDA or a BLA? And these data needs may be different, and they may differ after the endpoint is accepted, and also they may differ depending on what type of primary analysis or sensitivity analyses you're planning in your research or in your drug development. And finally, during this entire process, some important things I think are important to consider, and FDA may also, is how to link endpoints that are measured on different timescales in different environments. For example, how would we justify the use of daily exercise endpoints when the current endpoint for a disease is clinic observed exercise, and that's measured every 3 weeks? And that justification may help us understand and accept a novel endpoint. So thank you everyone for your time, and I look forward to hearing Stephen Blum's comments and hopefully a very interesting panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Andrew. So yes, now we will turn it over to Steve Blum with an industry perspective. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to briefly reflect on the presentations as well as share some of my thoughts from an industry perspective. I really enjoyed the presentations, and over the last few years, I've really enjoyed getting to learn about mobile health sensors and how we can use them to measure health-related quality of life. and how various different diseases and conditions impact people's lives. First, in terms of Jen's presentation, I'm really excited about the work that the Digital Medical Society is doing. It sounds like they're doing a lot of great work. Encourage all of our attendees to go out, check out their website, and if interested, to also see about getting involved with DIME. I know for sure I'm going to want to see how I personally can get involved with DIME and contribute to some of where the field is going. There's a lot of great resources on the site now. Looking forward to seeing the new resources that will be added later this month. At BMS, I've been helping to lead our digital health mHealth working group. We also developed our own playbook, which at a high level helps to communicate to our clinical teams how to best implement digital health outcomes in clinical trials. Our next step is actually to move to development of a more detailed operating model, which includes more detailed processes, roles, responsibilities, training requirements to ensure successful implementation in our studies. Jen spoke about a lot of great stuff, including the V3 framework. I heard about the framework in terms of the different aspects of validation, but hadn't heard about V3 as a term previously. But I really want to focus on her point about picking a measure that matters. Really encourage study teams to be thoughtful about the outcome measures that you're selecting, as well as picking a device that is both fit for purpose, as well as acceptable to your study population. A lot of these devices contain multiple types of sensors, and they can collect a lot of different data. You definitely don't want to take the kitchen sink approach here. You want to focus on a more narrow set of relevant endpoints. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of difficulty interpreting all the data that you have. For me, the bottom line is don't measure something just because you can, and also to pick your outcomes and endpoints before you pick your device. When you're thinking about your endpoints, think about things that are going to be meaningful to the population that you're studying. Also think about a holistic approach in how the digital health outcomes can complement your other COA measures as part of a comprehensive measurement strategy. So for me, the question is, when should you use a digital health outcome versus a COA measure? And for me, the sweet spot is when a device or sensor either allows you to measure something that you couldn't measure before, or it allows you to measure something more accurately and reliably than you could with a COA measure. That's when you should really consider using digital technologies. Moving on to Bill's presentation, Bill also spoke about implementation and some of the operational considerations. So it's not just a matter of picking the device or the endpoint, but a lot of other considerations about how the device gets used in your studies. So how the device is worn, where the device is worn, how often it's worn. All these things need to be pre-specified in your protocol. And you also need to ensure that your sites and your patients are adequately trained on how to use the device properly. You also need to consider what you're asking of both your sites and the patients that will be enrolling your study, because there is operational burden involved. So a lot of sites may not be familiar with using these types of technologies. They may not consider it to be mandatory. Again, that may depend on how it's implemented in your study. So you want to really make sure that they know what you're doing, asking them to do, and implementing it properly. I really encourage sponsors to get feedback from both their sites as well as patients, and determine what you're asking of them in the protocol is reasonable. For sites, consider including some questions on your site feasibility questionnaire to see, do they have prior experience with using any digital health technology or sensors. And for patients, seek their input. At BMS, we have a pilot study that we're just about to launch. It's our Lung Cancer in Motion mHealth pilot study. We have a strong patient engagement component. We actually have several patient advisors embedded as part of our study team. They've been providing input throughout the study. We originally were planning on using a medical grade device, but we received some feedback from our advisors that they really didn't like the device that we planned on using, and encouraged us to consider alternatives. So we actually put our study on hold for several months as we evaluated other device options, and ultimately decided to go with a consumer grade device, and we're using a special research API to collect the data. Speaking of the data, you also need to think about the volume of the data and the data flows, right? So how are you getting the data transferred off of the device? What's happening with that data in terms of how it's being normalized, analyzed, how you're bringing that data in-house. We're talking about very, very large data files, different file formats and structures that many of your clinical teams are used to having. Very granular data, and that's even with the process and Epoch level data, let alone the raw data alone, which isn't always available. So, thinking of all this, having something like the playbook is really helpful in terms of how your organization is set up to handle all the different operational aspects of implementing digital health outcomes in your studies, determining what capabilities your organization has or what you're going to be asking the vendors to do if a lot of this is being outsourced. As far as the Lilly and the chronic heart failure working group examples, we really need more studies like this. It's so important to try to understand, both which digital health outcomes are meaningful to patients, how best to use devices, the acceptability and feasibility of using these devices in studies. For my lung cancer emotion study, at its heart, it really is a qualitative study. We're really focusing on trying to understand what types of digital health outcomes and metrics are meaningful and relevant to lung cancer patients and survivors. But we're also collecting a lot of information on feasibility, usability, and acceptability of using a mobile sensor that will help to inform on our mHealth strategy at BMS. So just to kind of close my remarks, mobile health sensors, digital health outcomes, it's all really exciting. Personally, I've really enjoyed learning about digital health outcomes and sensors and how we can use them in conjunction with COA measures to kind of measure meaningful aspects of health that impact patients' lives. And again, really encourage sponsors to be thoughtful about thinking about what you're measuring and how you're measuring it. Choosing the right outcome measure, selecting the right device, making sure the study team and your patients are well prepared to use the device the way that you intended. And again, really encourage you to seek feedback and input from the patients, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to have to wear the device in the study. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thanks both to Andrew and Steve. We really appreciate hearing these additional perspectives. So now we're going to move on so we can take some questions from the audience. So as all our presenters turn their videos back on for questions, I just wanted to run through our quick reminder again. If you'd like to ask a question, please open your participant panel and then click on the hand icon in the lower right-hand corner to raise your hand. I'll call on your name in the order I see hands raised, and then please make sure to unmute your own phone line from your side, and then our host will unmute you as well. Once you hear the two beeps, please tell us your name and affiliation and ask your question to a specific panelist if possible. We do have over 250 attendees in today's session, so we'll get through as many questions as possible, but I do apologize in advance if we run out of time and can't get to everybody. But so now, as I kind of going to check out the list here to see if any hands are raised. Nothing that I see so far. So I did want to turn it over to Jiat to just get us started here as a panelist. So did you have any questions for maybe another panelist in our group here?
Sure. Hi. Sorry, just trying to figure out the double unmute thing. So I think my question would probably be for Bill and for maybe Andrew as well, either one of them. And that would be, I had it written down, sorry.
Oh, wait, Jiat, actually, can I interrupt? Sorry, I'll save you there. I did not see that actually hands are going up. So we'll save yours for the end if we can. So I guess first we'll turn to Christian Henke. Please unmute your line and we'll ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Christian Henke from EMD Toronto. And I'm interested in this topic, and I have a very general question, not sure who wants to address it. It's this kind of activity trackers and devices are in some way a commodity as of today, and people use it possibly in their daily life anyway. So there's a couple of questions related to that. So do you show what you measure to the patients in a trial, for example, because they might measure it anyway with their own device too, for example, number of steps? And also, when do you consider this no longer as a kind of measure, but as an intervention, when patients start to think about, oh, I should walk more because I'm measured?
Christian, it's Bill Byrom. That's a really good observation, and I think it's something that we're pondering. And I think my initial reaction to this is, well, when we conduct clinical research studies, we try to eliminate anything that might, have an effect on the intervention effect. And so, providing somebody with a device that is showing them how many steps they do per day, if you gave that to me, I would set myself a target of my 10,000 steps, and I'd probably try and improve on that on a weekly basis. So it becomes part of the intervention. And so I think we need to be careful. Now, I don't think that means that we can't use those devices, but perhaps there's patient education that we need to explore in terms of, look, hey, we're giving this device for a purpose, and we don't want you to sort of, use it in this sort of competitive way that might influence the results. Just use it normally. But I don't know, maybe others have got an opinion on the panel as well.
So this is Steve. So we actually had that come up as a conversation when we had one of our study design meetings for my pilot study. The original device that we planned on using, which was a medical grade device, did not have any type of display. And the feedback that we had from our patient advisors were, that why would they want to wear a device if they didn't know what data was being collected from it? And one of the things that we talked about was, does seeing the step count or something like that, potentially bias the results? Maybe a little bit, but again, it came down to acceptability of the device itself, and for a lot of lung cancer patients, that are involved in rehabilitation, their doctors have asked them to keep track of their steps. So why would they have to wear two different devices, one that shows their steps and one that doesn't? So, the bias may be a bit overstated. It maybe depends on the individual or the population that you're looking at. But if it's information that's important to the patient, something that they want to see, not being able to see that on the device may lead to poor compliance. So that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, as I mentioned before in my presentation, we allowed participants to see their own data with regards to the Fitbit data, because they were uploading it and syncing it to the Fitbit app, but then also with regards to the Arthritis Power Registry electronic data collection. While we didn't provide them all the daily measures that they were completing, like we didn't provide that data back to them, they were every week given kind of a summary of the aggregate measures that they had. And so that allowed, and I think patients, from the feedback that we got, appreciated being able to monitor kind of their own health for themselves as well, to kind of say, okay, I did this yesterday and this is why I'm not feeling that well. And that, I guess, in a way does bias it slightly, but I do think that it may, especially in the observational setting, be overstated that how much of that bias actually plays a part.
And just to pile on to respond to a really terrific question, City actually came up with a terrific resource. It's a decision algorithm to help for trial designers work with patients. So Stephen, you're exactly right. We've got to work with sort of, participant representatives to make the right choice. But there's a really nice algorithm that City created that we actually include in the playbook as a reference, as a really terrific way to support teams actively thinking about this. I also think it comes back to this idea of selecting measures that matter. I think we've got to trust our participants as partners here. And if we're measuring something about their condition that's really important to them, they are inherently, going to be much more committed to that sort of adherence to the technology protocol. And then finally, I think it doesn't always have to be outcomes data that you're sharing in real time, right? On the one hand, something like step count, it seems very intuitive that that would be sort of the first choice. In those examples or those settings where sharing the outcomes data in real time may actually sort of skew the results we're getting, there's lots of other information we can report back to participants to make them feel engaged, to make them feel valued during the course of the study, and then obviously return the full data set to them at the end. So I definitely think there's always a way to do this thoughtfully, and what a terrific question to get us started.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thanks for that question. I see the next question is from Laura Lee Johnson.
Hi, and I want to thank everybody for their discussion and presentation. So I have two questions, I think. Actually, whenever I hear Steve, I start taking a lot of massive notes. So I might have more as I start reading through all of that too. But I think this first one's probably for Jen, but I open it up to all of you. Maybe I missed it, but it seemed like the definition of digital endpoints didn't quite follow the definition of an endpoint that FDA and NIH have in the best glossary. So I wanted to hear from you all and hear some comments as to why those may not mesh up. And then also a second question is if you can provide some thoughts on how you differentiate between the analytic and clinical validation, for example, in the case of Parkinson's, where the measurement of steps or derived endpoints might be impacted by the disease. Thank you.
Hey, Laura, happy to jump on that first. I don't think I defined digital endpoint because you're exactly right. It jives exactly with how the best glossary describes an endpoint. It just happens to be measured using a digital tool. I feel really strongly that we shouldn't be creating new categories of COAs. We shouldn't be creating new categories of biomarker or endpoint. We're simply using a different methodology to measure. So, I just want to sort of underscore that you're exactly correct. I think that we need to be very, very thoughtful to not reinvent the wheel and rather just support the lexicon that supported us really well to date, and just recognize that there's a new methodology available to execute those measures. So glad you made the point.
Do folks have thoughts on the second question?
And just to add on that, I just wanted to make a note that, within the PURO Consortium working group, we do have a group that's focused on wearables and, identifying the need for a consensus and, some of the terminology that we're using and standards for, using these technologies. So, it is an area where I think that there isn't a lot of clear consensus on some of the terminology, and obviously we can incorporate what's included in the best glossary, but CPATH and the PURO Consortium is looking at this as another project.
Any other comments from the panel? Okay. Otherwise, we will move on to our next question I see from Jonathan Comans.
Yes, thank you. I guess, can you hear me?
Yes.
That was, it took me like 10 minutes just to figure out how to raise my hand. So I guess my question goes to Steve Blum or else Jiat, Ling, regarding. I really like this correlation analysis that you guys created or you looked at between the objective measures and the patient-reported measures. And I also like this concept of it's not really it's data and it's just different ways to approach the data. So my question is, in terms of linearity. And this, I've seen with my own work that, I'm a pro-COA specialist at Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk, and I'm American, but I'm living over in Denmark. Anyways, so my question was, I've seen with my own research that patient-reported outcome and these objective measures do not correlate, or sometimes correlate, and they'll correlate, or they'll correlate highly, but with really low correlation. I mean, statistically significant, but with low correlations. And the concept of linearity. If we're looking at scales, we're actually correlating different scales. And where do you guys have anything to contribute in terms of like the concept of validation of patient-reported outcomes? And like stringency in the validation process, like item response theory, rationale, or there's a lot of different varying views on that, and also the other way around on the digital data acquisition as well. Does that make sense to any of you guys? My question.
Yeah.
I guess, Stephen, you can take it off, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of it is going to come down to both the recall period of your PRO measure, as well as the measurement period for the device and how you're specifying your endpoint. So if you're just looking at something like total steps per day, you're losing a lot of information about each activity bout, or looking at the more granular data may provide additional insights, and you may lose that depending on the period in which your data is being summarized at, or for your PRO measure, the recall period that you're looking at. So again, I think a lot of it is going to come down to understanding the data that you're working with and the granularity of that data and what you can do with that. And I think if you're looking and you're rolling up that data, I think you're going to lose a lot of the little nuances that may be meaningful. So I think a lot of it comes down to endpoint specification and the sensitivity of the measures and the period in which you're measuring that information, and looking at activity over the course of the past week with the PRO measure may not give you a lot of insights, where you may have a lot of day-to-day variability in terms of someone's activity levels.
I totally agree with what Steve said there, and then to add on to that as well, I think we with regard to activity and PRO measures, I think there's also a lot of heterogeneity, just because we're humans, and so there are a lot of the reasons for the correlations being pretty low, which is not atypical of a lot of this kind of data that we see, is because there's so much unexplained heterogeneity that we're not able to account for, and so just because of the way someone maybe responds copes, like I mentioned earlier, right? But their coping mechanisms are in response to, say, pain, for example. Some people just work through it and continue about their daily activities. Others will just sit at home and cozy up on their couch or something with a cup of coffee. And so I think being able to contextualize that, and that's why I believe too in that co-complementary nature of both types of data sources, being able to put that into context, trying to figure out how much more you can explain to the best of your abilities that unobserved heterogeneity is very important for us, I think, across and it will probably be specific to the disease state as well.
Yeah, we need both, and the different angles. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and add to this. Oh, sorry, this is Milena. Did I interrupt somebody? Sorry,
go ahead.
I also wanted to chime in. I'm not sure that just because we use the same label, we are actually necessarily measuring the same thing with the activity monitor and with asking a patient about their activity or physical function. Actually, the qualitative data suggested that's probably not the case unless you have a very, very narrowly defined questions that you're asking patients how many steps a day do you think you make. But most of the physical function or physical activity PROs do not ask them at that granular level. So I think because patients report more on their experience, and when you ask them, they really are thinking more about this aspect of, am I able to do the things that matter to me? The activity monitor cannot give you that information. So I'm not sure we are assessing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Jiat, I mean, in your data, I was really quite interested because, you know, the association between pain and activity, and you looked at that, you found, I think, fairly modest negative correlations between the pain scores and the total steps per day or distance walked or whatever. But, you know, and maybe you think, well, okay, that might give me some face validity on that activity measure, because that kind of makes intuitive sense that they'd be negatively correlated. But actually, I don't know that it necessarily does give face validity, because we don't really understand the relationship between those two. And actually, in some pain studies, we know that activity data actually helps to explain the pain score. So, for example, you've got a patient who is feeling better, they're feeling less pain, so they actually become more active, and as a consequence of that greater activity, their pain scores go up again. And it's not that they're not recovering, it's actually, you know, so it's almost the composite of the pain score and the activity measure that's telling you what's going on with the patient.
No, I totally agree, and I like that you use that. I think one of my favorite examples too, this may be a little sidetrack, is, you know, we've heard anecdotal stories of the RA patient who's doing much better on treatment, but then when you look at their activity, they're hardly moving at all, and it's because now they can use their fingers, which is what they like, you know, which is what their hobby is, you know, like knitting or sewing or whatever, rather than walking about, you know, on the street.
I know we are basically at the end of the time here, but Andrew, any other closing remarks you wanted to make in relation to any of these questions that came up?
I mean, I guess I'm still a little bit interested in how, like, for oops, sorry, I think I accidentally hit my mic. For like in validation, how when we have how we start to think about splitting apart kind of a clinical and an analytic validation when the disease that we're looking at can affect aspects of both, and it's not, and sort of a little bit more like with Parkinson's, where, you know, the properties of, you know, maybe the steps and the endpoint are impacted by the disease, sort of how that kind of all works together. And it's sort of, I think, something that I know I'm interested in really thinking a little bit more about. So, but otherwise, it's been very interesting discussion, and hopefully this can start to generate good, high quality evidence for all of these for these endpoints.
Angie, can I just riff off that for 30 seconds before we wrap up, because it's such an important piece of the jigsaw?
Please do. Please do.
One of the things that, you know, we're increasingly seeing is a rush to conduct analytical validation, and whether that's not considering the performance of an optical sensor across different skin tones, for example, whether that's not considering the full breadth of the population that you're interested in as you do it, because we haven't previously allowed time for this step. And I think folks are unsure of it. They may be relying on external partners. I think analytical validation, in the example that you gave, it's absolutely critical that we include the full scope of the population who are involved. And it will be absolutely detrimental for the field if we don't do that. So I'm delighted you brought that up. If we start passing it out, analytical validation and clinical validation, I think it's useful to have a modular approach. But if somehow in that process the breadth of the population gets dropped, we're going to do more harm than good. And we're starting to see that, as I said. I think the biases we're seeing across skin tones in optical sensors is a great example. You raised another great example there, thinking about how, you know, steps or gait may change if we don't consider the full breadth of the population in the analytical validation. So what a great point to end on. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Thanks so much, Jen. So that's going to have to be our last word. Thank you again so much to all our presenters and panelists for taking part in this session, and to those from the audience that chimed in with questions. It was a great discussion.